Khmer people came close to extinction in December 1979. He writes, and continues, I'm going to do my part to make sure this great culture and people continue. This is Kosol's motto. Thank you again, Kosol. And I will pass it on to Joe Eggers, who's coordinating the Bridges of Memory program.
Thank you, Alejandro. Just briefly on Bridges of Memory, the center has had the privilege to work with a number of communities in the Twin Cities that have been impacted by genocide and mass violence over the last year as part of a College of Liberal Arts Engagement Hub project. And our project strives to connect and build better relationships between the university and the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies with these communities, but also more importantly, within communities amongst each other. One of our I think our strong relationships have been with the Kamiya community and Kosol, working with the museum. We've worked with them on several workshops. And so I'm really excited to be here. And this is, I think, especially exciting for George and I as we spent a few weeks in Cambodia last summer. So, thank you for all attending. The work of this project is going to continue, like Alejandro said, through the next year. And we hope to have more of these community dialogues moving forward and continue to work to be better neighbors with our communities surrounding the university. So if you have any questions, you can always contact us. There's more information on our website. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Alejandro and Joe. Tonight, for the remainder of our webinar, I'm going to lead a little bit of a conversation with Kosol, and so I might offer a few questions and he'll respond, and then hopefully towards the end of the evening we'll have time for a Q&A with participants. And so I would encourage you, as questions come up, especially if you don't want to forget them, feel free to type them into the chat. And then towards the end of the evening, we'll turn our attention to the chat and hopefully we'll be able to address some of those questions. And so I guess with that, Kosol, if you're okay, I would jump right in maybe with the first question, and which is, could you share a little bit about the Cambodian, the Khmer community in the Twin Cities?
Yes, George. First off, I'd like to thank the whole team, Professor Alejandro, Baer, and you, George, and Joe, for the opportunity to have this presence this evening. In many ways, it's sort of like the fruit of the labor tonight, where we're reaping in the fruit of trying to get the message, the stories out there, to be able to have this type of opportunity to share the stories and the journey of the genocide survivors from Cambodia. It's definitely an honor. So thank you, everyone, again. And typically, before we commence any important event, we always start with a namaste, right? Namaste. That is a very formal and routine salutation in Khmer. So thank you. Can I have that question again, please, George?
Absolutely. Just if you could share a little bit about the Khmer community in the Twin Cities in Minnesota.
Yes, the Khmer community, the Cambodian community, has roughly 13,300 and some members. There's a cluster in Dakota County as a growth out of St. Paul. The majority of the Cambodian community, the members were immigrated, and they resided in St. Paul for the most part. And there's also another cluster in Rochester, Minnesota, which has roughly 2,000 to 3,000 in numbers. Out of St. Paul, with the Northwest Airline as being the major employer in the late 70s and early 1980s. The community sort of moved outward, southbound towards Dakota County. So right now, everybody sort of knows everybody. The community is very small. familiar faces. You can almost, it's sort of like the cliche of the America's small town where everybody knows everybody's last names, and they sort of know your story and your history. And I think the same applies here in the Cambodian community in Minnesota, and to a great extent even throughout the U.S.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I really appreciate that, and sharing a little bit about the community here. I wonder if I could ask about how the Khmer community has preserved some of their culture and traditions in Minnesota, and maybe if there are struggles in preserving culture and traditions here in the United States and in Minnesota.
The Cambodian community, in comparison to the other Southeast Asian communities, we're fortunate in the sense that there's a higher number in population throughout the U.S. You have the greatest concentration in Long Beach, California. You have the second highest in Lowell, Massachusetts, and you have the third highest in Seattle, Washington, and Minnesota ranks about 4th place. So we're fortunate in the sense that if you're looking at it as on a national scale, the Cambodian community has a higher number in population when you compare it to the Hmong, when you compare it to the Laotian, the Thais, Indonesians, with perhaps the Vietnamese community being a little bit higher. But in Minnesota, we're actually low in number, 13,000 in comparison to the Hmong population. You have roughly about 60,000, 70,000, and then the Vietnamese has about 40,000. The Laotian population is roughly about the same as the Cambodians. So very small. So our voice is relatively silent for the most part. So whenever we have an opportunity to showcase with the U of M, the Genocide and Holocaust Studies Center here, it's definitely an honor, because it allows a community with very little voice to be magnified with our stories and our history.
Maybe moving right along, I'd ask about the role of the genocide in the Cambodian community overall, but then also here in Minnesota.
The community has, for the most part, has sort of shied from the genocide as a whole. Maybe a sense of more of an unconscious, more of a subliminal fear of revisiting a part of history that's responsible for us being here. George, I would say that even today, 60 to 70% of the Cambodian American population, and even Cambodian Americans in general, are still sort of restarting a new life. Despite the fact that we've been here 40 years, myself and my family, we've been here since the early 1980s, so almost 40 years. So despite the numbers, the pains and the suffering and the people that have journeyed through traumatized moments in their lives, even as American born, can empathize with genocide survivors who have not only lost families, they've lost dignity, they've lost entire family lines. So they've lost a lot more than just one misfortune or one bad idea or one wrong mistake. For the most part, a genocide survivor, and more specifically a Cambodian genocide survivor, is someone who had lost everything. And a hidden secret is that some of them have lost their last names, George. They've lost their last names, they've lost their birth dates. I would venture to say that at least 20–30% of the population couldn't take an oath and swear on the authenticity of their birth dates. From the start of the genocide, the documents, records were destroyed, they were burned, and many of the 55 to 65 age group today, they've sort of lost their teen years, you know, and so these survivors who came here when they were 14 years of age, ranging upward to their late teens, they've lost their most important years of their lives, and now they're in America, they're in Minnesota, charged with starting a new life. So for the genocide survivors, for the genocide in Minnesota, it continues to be a story that's not very well cherished. It's not cherished, it's very feared. You may not get that kind of adjectives from a one-on-one conversation or a discussion, but you will sense it, because myself, after having given hundreds of tours at a museum, I still have my moments where something triggers, and then you have a moment of reality checks again. And so for a lot of our community members, they're still struggling, especially the 55 plus age group. The 55 below age group, where I belong to, we're kind of like the bridge between the old and the young. When you get below the 30 age group, then you get into a demographic where the Cambodian Americans really don't have a clear identity of where they came from. They've sort of missed out on their history and the stories. Their parents who had lost 10–15 years of their lives didn't have the opportunity to have gained the awareness or to have been educated about their own identity. So here, these 55 and 40 years ago, these teens are now charged with educating their own families, their own children. And, you know, you can't teach what you don't know. And so that's what we're kind of going through now. And 5 years ago, this week in particular. So thank you for having this event this week, because this symposium, this webinar marks our 5th anniversary of the Khmer Legacy Museum in St. Paul. And we are slowly moving towards a virtual museum to be able to reach more of the population, as well as the non-Khmer population. So 5 years of trying to remind the elders that there is a museum here that where their voice belongs. At the same time, we try to promote to the younger generation to kind of give them a sense of a feeling of home, a feeling of comfort, where there are stories that can inspire them, and there are stories where they shouldn't forget, and there are stories that perhaps their parents or their grandparents might be reluctant to sharing on a one-on-one basis. So hopefully that's not an elongated response.
No, I really appreciate that, and especially bringing in some of the work that you've been doing and that the museum is doing. You know, I wonder, I do want to ask about, you know, the community and, you know, commemorating the genocide, but I wonder if I could ask about your experiences. And you mentioned kind of this, you know, being of a generation where you're a bridge between the young and the old. And I wonder, you know, what it was like for you growing up in a family of survivors, but also kind of in that role as, you know, this bridge role between two generations. If you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, for the most part, survivors typically break down into two groups. You have the farmers, the countrymen and women of Cambodia, and then you have the sort of the survivors of the I hesitate to use the word intelligentsia, because there are other members of the population that were executed, that were exterminated. Typically, they're survivors of people who were involved in politics, who were people who were involved in the arts, people who were involved in activism, people who were statesmen and stateswomen. So you either have survivors of people who were leaders in the country, or you have survivors of people who were everyday countrymen, countrywomen, peasants for the most part. So many of them. So even now in 2020, you sort of have a clash. You sort of have this clash of people from the same country, but with very diverse backgrounds. And myself, I came here. My mother and I immigrated here in the early '80s, and my father was a former deputy mayor of a province in Cambodia, and so we come here. We started off with a large family, and now we're kind of down in numbers. So we have to start over in the early '80s, and my recollection of my first impression of Minnesota was that it was very cold. It was a February 26th, 27th. So it's a cold time of the year for someone that came from a tropical climate. And I recall just my mother and I carrying this poster board with our names on it, looking for our sponsor who came to pick us up. So in the early '80s, we didn't really, or at least I didn't really feel pain or suffering, or because it's hard to feel pain and suffering when there's no comparison. It's hard to contrast America with something that at that time a 6-7-year-old didn't have. You know, being born in '74 meant that I was pretty much a child of the genocide. You know, because in 1975, that was when year zero began. So anybody who was born in '74, '75, '76, these were people who were classified as genocide children. You know, so we don't remember a whole lot. The people who are 5 years or older than myself, today they would be in their early 50s. They would have a better memory as to the suffering. Those of my age group, we sort of have the benefit of having our psychological pause of those early years. It sort of protects us, where if you were to ask me in detail if I could describe what happened before 1982, I can probably write a book with about 2 or 3 pages. So not a whole lot of facts and details, except that it wasn't a lot of joyous moments. It wasn't a childhood of toys and abundance, that's for sure. And then we came here in the mid 80s. It was really a matter of trying to assimilate, a matter of trying to understand this new homeland, this new climate that we have, trying to speak English. I'm not quite sure how English became my spoken language, most likely from watching Sesame Street and Super Friends and some of the PBS TV shows. And for the most part, my experience is the same experience for most of the population, especially for those who are under 55 and over 40 years of age.
Thank you for sharing that. I wonder if I could jump into the question that it was on the tip of my tongue before, but I'm wondering about efforts and maybe even tensions. You've kind of pointed out that the over 55 generation has shied away in some ways from thinking about and talking about publicly perhaps the genocide. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the community has attempted to recognize the genocide, commemorate the genocide.
Yeah, the community as a whole, it's difficult for us to empathize because we think of memorializing as a certain date, like Memorial Day or Veterans Day, July 4th. For the Cambodian community, there's nothing to memorialize because they live it every single day. So I recognize that the state of Minnesota has sort of a genocide day in April. I believe it's April 15th or 16th. And we would promote events to get people to talk, to share stories. And for the past several years, we've not been successful, George. We've not been successful. People don't show up, and we've made many attempts to record stories, video documentaries of veterans, of everyday people, to kind of share their journey. What happened in the 70s, what did they recall, what did they miss out on, and what are some of their hopes and dreams for the future. We sort of had a project where we wanted to record maybe 30 to 40 different perspectives from the Cambodian community, and to date we completed maybe 7. So it took us about 5 years to complete fewer than 10 stories. So to get people to talk about painful moments in their lives, I've come to appreciate the pain that the elders feel, and it's something where 5 years ago, prior to having launched our museum, I didn't know that the pain was this deep, was so deep to the point where people are afraid to resurface those moments in life, and a pain so deep where they sometimes, George, a lot of the survivors were former veterans, they were former child soldiers, they were former diplomats, and people just don't talk about their past because sometimes it's been a crossroad with their neighbors. people are living in America today, but they're still in fear of maybe other members of the community might discover what they did in the past, or what their some of their backgrounds, and so a lot of, and in particular, a lot of the child soldiers who are in their 50s today, they didn't do things. Some of the acts that they carried out were very noble acts. So that's one of the reasons why they kind of hide these secrets, and they're reluctant to sharing them, because it's a story that only they know. And unless and until we become more versed and more efficient in using social media and video conferencing, and unless we can lure people into sharing more about themselves, it'll remain a difficult project for us to complete. Again, 5 years, we've documented fewer than 10 stories. We were shooting for 30 to 40 stories.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds daunting. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the work that you've done, or the museum's done, or just work in general to try to make sure that younger generations, especially, students who are or children who are, maybe adolescents now, are aware of, I'm thinking both the genocide, but also, efforts to keep Khmer culture alive within the Twin Cities, and, make sure students have an awareness of their background.
Yeah, thanks, George. In 2012, 2013, I had returned from Cambodia after working there for 5 years, and I stumbled into an organization that was charged with advocating for the recognition of the Southeast Asians during the Secret War of Southeast Asia in the late 60s and 70s. Myself, I'm not a veteran, and none of the survivors in my family is a veteran. So here I am, I'm faced with a group of 40 to 50 men and women in Minnesota who were doing this odd thing called lobbying for recognition. And I didn't, and I'm not someone that was active in advocating for any kind of legislation. So, but it intrigued me, because after a few months, it sort of dawned on me that they were looking for legacy. They were looking for meaning for their presence here in America. So these men and women who were in their 60s, 70s, and some in their 80s were who had never knocked on the doors of the House of Representatives, the senators, people who had never visited Washington, D.C. ever, had gone on trips with us to Washington, D.C. and knocking on doors of senators and representatives' offices, pleading for a vote, for a passage of a simple resolution to basically, and a simple resolution has really no monetary value, other than a simple recognition that the stories and the history of what happened in Cambodia and Southeast Asia actually happened. So these men and women wanted America to affirm that these books that had been written by many different authors and veterans, American veterans, and were true and remain true. They wanted these hundreds of documentaries and different films about the Vietnam War, these documents with the CIA and the American government. They wanted to really affirm the authenticity of these stories, because up until 2012, most of the most of the Southeast Asian population as a whole basically thought of themselves as simply refugees. People didn't. They thought, well, we were refugees. We came here, and we didn't know how we got here. But we got here. We're in America, so therefore we must be American. And then as people age, they started to ask questions, and one of those questions is, well, why did you come here? What got you here? Well, these veterans were given priority to come to America. So because they fought alongside American armed forces with secret documents and secret missions that even today our American government are reluctant to resurface, because that's why it's called a secret war. It's a war full of secrets. So these Southeast Asians and these Cambodian Americans, they wanted the truth to be told, because for the most part, a lot of these men and women, they're in their 80s, and some were in their early 90s, and they wanted this legacy to solidify before they pass on. So so in 2012, between 2012 and 2014, we did a lot of advocacy work at the state and also at the federal level to demand recognition. We did receive that. We received in the state state senate and state representatives. We went to the Senate in DC. It didn't pass Washington. It didn't pass the House of Representatives. But that wasn't the point. The point was to kind of ink a moment in history for the Southeast Asians, so that 50 years from now, 100 years from now, my children and my grandchildren can come to the U of M's website, or can go to the Library of Congress website and type in Cambodian Americans, and they would see the history of how their parents and grandparents came to America. So that was my involvement, my introduction to this organization. And then when we received the recognition in 2014, I was faced with the question of, well, now what? Now you got the recognition, and you have the Hmong people, the Vietnamese, the Laotian, and the Cambodians. Now you receive the recognition that you so well deserve. So now, what next? So we decided to found a museum. At the time, we called it Khmer Legacy Museum, which was to preserve evidences, to protect facts and stories and films and arts and culture, and also to promote outside of the Cambodian community, outside of the Southeast Asian community, because in the community, our intra-community relations wasn't going to change a whole lot. People are afraid of speaking out. So in order to get this message out there, we need to speak with the outside world, which again, we faced a second challenge, because our community has, for the most part, been very silent, has been very shy, has been very, some, I would say, shameful, and the language barrier didn't make that journey any simpler. So we decided to do a lot more promotion, promoting in different public venues, and using the media to kind of get the story out there, recognizing and realizing that if we don't do this now, then the younger generation, the 30 and under age group, they will likely never understand why they're here, what brought them here, and why they should be proud of who they are. The purpose of our project had always been to sort of reverse the effects of the genocide. The genocide survivors are a group of people who feel they've been raped of their dignity, they've been raped of their families, they've been raped of their psychologically, And some of these guys, men and women, they have these scars that they live on a day-to-day basis. So the solution here will be to make these people who feel they've been devalued, they've been taken advantage of, they've been robbed of the very essence of what makes a human being worth something in life, to return that to them. So we want to create it. So we create the museum as a mechanism, as a platform to make people feel important again, to make them feel that their history is an important part of American history, to make them feel that their arts and their culture, their many thousand years of heritage is important, and to make the young Cambodian Americans and the young Southeast Asian Americans feel that it's worth embracing, it's worth valuing, because it's part of their identity. It's almost as important as embracing your last names. It's almost as important as wanting to share something special about yourself. And if you don't promote the importance and the values, promote the positive contributions of why they're here in America, then the consequence is that they're just going to forget about it, or they're going to pretend like that they're not part of that identity, and which is something that we don't want to do, because that's what a genocide is. A genocide is a series of activities to exterminate a human being's worth, a human being's dignity, a human being's history and story. And if the elders fail to communicate that, if the elders fail to continue that, and the younger generation fail to receive that, and the younger generation refuse to accept what happened as facts, as truth, then the genocide becomes a success. So the idea of the museum, the idea of promoting a lot of these projects that we do on a day-to-day basis is really to kind of rejuvenate the positive, and for the younger population, the coolness, the cool factors of their identity. Hopefully that answers your question, George.
No, it does, and I love that, the coolness, the cool factor. I wonder if I could ask about. So I'm interested in, and maybe this is a little bit out of the work that you do, but I know there are a number of teachers in the audience, and a big focus of this series will be to think about education and the role of education in thinking about some of these histories and legacies in school. And I wonder, do you have a sense that Cambodian Khmer culture is being brought into schools in Minnesota? And I guess maybe I would ask, I wonder if you have words of advice for teachers, or things that you wish teachers were taking up in public schools in Minnesota, either about the genocide or Khmer culture, or things that you wish teachers maybe knew about the Khmer community within the Twin Cities.
Yeah, thank you, George. It's a very important question. I don't think we've done a wide enough effort to include the distinct qualities of the immigrants in Minnesota. I think sometimes we're kind of forced or pressured to kind of group people, grouping Southeast Asians, grouping East Asians, grouping North Africans, grouping, and sometimes even myself, I make the mistake by grouping the Somalis with the Ethiopians, which is taboo. And people have a history of not getting along, and so when we group these people into our conversation, sometimes we have the unintended consequence of some of the backlash that we see in society. Because when you you look at a Cambodian American, perhaps for the younger generation, it may not be as impactful as for the 35 and up age group. But to call a Cambodian a Vietnamese, or to call a Cambodian a Hmong or a Laotian, it sort of dilutes the value of the person's identity. It's almost as if I were to blindly refer to George as someone from Italy. Oh, George, hey, how you doing? How is the guys in Italy doing? So the emphasis could be improved in how we teach the children in the school system. And people, George, people like to feel special. When you see, when I'm traveling, I look out there and I see a bunch of people who look Asian to me. And even amongst the Asians, there's some hesitation to kind of to offer salutations or to offer namastes, because people are afraid of, because they're wondering, where is he from? He looks like he's Vietnamese, but is he Cambodian? Is he Laotian? But when you seek to understand and you find out that that person is Cambodian, and you say, well, Kosol, my stepdaughter's friend is from Cambodia, and then right away I feel a sense of value. I feel that teacher, that person in front of me, recognizes who I am as a person and not as a group. And I know sometimes in our project as a nonprofit organization, we're kind of pressured because of funding issue, because of time constraints. We try to do things as a group. We want to bring the Hmong together with the Vietnamese, with the Cambodians. However, at times, certain events, if all of the parties offer their consensus or to do or to pay forward an event of Southeast Asians, then we kind of come prepared, knowing that, hey, this is an event for Southeast Asians. But if you were to do an event for Cambodian Americans, and then you spend the first hour of your event talking about stories and history of the Hmong refugees, that may not connect well. And growing up, I was fortunate to have received my education from kindergarten, and to this day, I give a lot of my my love and my and my thought process to my English teacher, to my ESL teacher from elementary school, in fact throughout elementary school, because she understood who I was. She was teaching a few Hmong children at the time, and I was the only Cambodian, and we had a Vietnamese, but she was able to highlight, and she was able to empathize our journey, but she was also, she didn't dilute the value of the differences in identity. And I think that's very important, George, because sometimes we feel like it's no big deal. Just as an example, I was at a Fort Snelling Memorial Day parade about 3 years ago. Every year we would take our group of Southeast Asians, not just the Cambodians, and myself, even though I'm not a veteran, I feel it's an important day for Southeast Asians to sort of validate their history of why they're here. So we would take part in the Fort Snelling event, and I recall a wonderful woman. In fact, she's a director of a nonprofit organization that works with veterans, and she came up to me and she said, "You know what? You people are just some of the greatest people I've ever met. So I feel this sense of, wow, well, thank you. And then she went on, she said, you know, I work with this, I work with this guy named something Wang Yang. He worked for 15, 20 years, didn't take a single day off of work. And he's the greatest Hmong guy that I've ever met. And whenever I see you guys, I feel like, I mean, you guys are just examples of what hard work can do and can pay off in America. So I thought, well, that makes sense. But I think she could have improved a little bit in being able to distinguish, or at least to sort of mirror her understanding of the Southeast Asians, and not clustering this group of people. So to shorten my response, I think we could do a better job, George. We could definitely do a much better job, not for the teachers alone, but for the students. When you identify the students and you know what their wants are, their needs are, then you can understand where they're coming from, and then you can offer a solution to achieving their hopes and dreams. But if you can't identify with who they are as a person, then it's very difficult. And then they kind of grow up thinking, well, you know, I'm just part of this Asian community. So then there's no encouragement, there's no motivation, or there's no inspiration to promote who they are. Because why would I want to promote myself as a Cambodian American when I'm already clustered as an Asian American?
No, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for that response. And, you know, I love thinking about the hopes and dreams of students and the importance of identity for teachers and everyone connected to education and, you know, working with young people. I guess I really want to make sure we have time to turn things over to the audience to ask questions. And so maybe I would ask really just one more question. And okay. It's perhaps a little bit of an unfair question, but just are there other things that you would want to share with the audience tonight, you know, either about the genocide or about the Khmer community in the Twin Cities that we just haven't touched on?
Yeah, thank you, George. Not just the Khmer community, and you know, we have current events that sort of interconnect in terms of people of different background assimilating or adopting this new homeland that we call America. I think it's so important whether you're talking about Cambodians or Vietnamese or a Black American or Hispanic American or any population that we classify as genocide survivors. It's very important that we understand that they're human beings who want to feel important too. Yeah, they're people who want to feel important. So, and as teachers, I think teachers play such a significant role, such a pivotal role in directing that energy that all of us are born with, and that's sort of responsible for how we chart our future. To have these teachers make their student feel important, make them feel like, hey, you're different. You bring something that is different, but it has value in our homeland, in our community. Not just something that's different and awkward and weird and unusual. And you know, when you see someone that's different, I've sort of seasoned in how I look at things. When I see somebody that has a different background or has a different or someone who may have walked a different journey in life, I've come to appreciate them because they're bringing a different perspective. They're bringing a different story, a different example, a different paradigm that I can relate to from a different focal point. Whereas I think before, when you look at, or when I look at someone that who has a different background, for me. I look at them as, wow, that's so difficult to get along with these people because they're so different. They wear different clothes. They have different customs. They value different things in life. And then I recall back in the early 80s where the Cambodians were wearing sarongs. They were wearing sandals. We would bring these weird and unusual apparel to America. And at that time, they were odd. They were unusual. And nowadays, it's sort of, it's the trend. It's the fashion. It's the coolness, the cool factor. So I think it's very important that we embrace differences. People, whether they are Cambodian or not Cambodians, that we sort of, we tell them that they're important, and we encourage them to share their differences, because not to understand, not to try to pity them, not to make them feel like we need to climb a mountain to understand them, but to welcome them, to welcome the differences, because those differences make up who we are, to make up our identity as American.
I really appreciate that. Thank you so much, Kosol. This has just been fascinating for me, and just a real pleasure to be able to hear a little bit about your experience and about the community in the Twin Cities. I'd love to, at this point, turn it over to questions from the audience, and maybe I'd ask my colleague Joe to help me kind of organize and field some of those questions from the chat. And so I would encourage everyone in the audience to please share questions, and we'll try to bring those forward.
Yeah, we have actually a few questions about resources and content, recommending either books or resources for the classroom, documentaries that talk about or getting a better understanding of the genocide.
Is that to George or to me?
Well, I think either one, but I think, Kosol, I think you probably have a better idea.
Okay, we have at our museum we have hundreds of books that unfortunately don't get read enough, and I think one of the books that we promoted were I think it's called Never Forget, which talks about the journey of the veterans and how the Southeast Asians, how and why they're here. I think it's important for Southeast Asians and for Cambodians to know that they're not here by accident, and they're not here against their will either, because the war happened and everyone made a conscious decision to come to America and to build a new life. But I would say a book by Stephen Yednock titled Never Forget is a good book, and there's a number of historians out of Australia. Names aren't clicking with me. We are fortunate to have one of our board member at the IKARE for the museum. He's a former Harvard Law School professor, dean, or assistant dean at Harvard Law School. So he is more knowledgeable. So about the Khmer history than even myself. I think I'm more knowledgeable in terms of the actual journey of a genocide survivor, where Steve has maybe 30 years more experience in terms of the geopolitics, in terms of the causes and the effects of the Vietnam War, and the debris that brought or that blew into America here. So there are a lot of books out there, but I would focus more on the topics that would really that could inspire a lot of the teachers into having a deeper understanding about the Southeast Asians, and that would be to understand the veterans. the stories of the veterans, and also another one titled Children of the Genocide Survivors. One of our volunteers at the museum, he was a child soldier that was raped during the war. It took him many years to come forth to share his stories, and for many years, you know, we looked at him as a leader in the community. And it wasn't until recently when he stepped up and he said, "Kosol, I need you to do me a favor. Can you start telling my story?" And this is a man who has 3-4 children now, and they are in their 20s, and he's coming out. So these are stories that are or that have affected the new Americans, and you couldn't tell by looking at them, because they're engineers. Some of them are nurses and doctors, people in IT department. So you couldn't tell just by having a day-to-day conversation with them, but they'll come out because they are stories. They're that, you know, as they become more comfortable with your friendship, they start to share more. So Children of the Genocide is one, and then you have the books like Never Forget by Stephen Yetneck, and then you have, of course, they have the Killing Fields of the 1980s. That's also a good documentary. I believe they have that in book form and video format that you can watch even on YouTube now. So these are the three components that make up, I think, the importance of why someone who is a genocide survivor is here, and what we need to do to better empathize for the experience.
Maybe I'd step in with a follow-up question here. So I know I teach a high school course, a comparative genocide studies high school course, and I think for a long time struggled to get resources around Cambodia, more so than some of the other, you know, like Rwanda perhaps, or the Holocaust for sure. And I'm wondering about your thoughts on the book and now the movie with Angelina Jolie, The First They Killed My Father. If you could just say a few words about that as a resource. And yeah.
Yeah, the First They Killed My Father. In fact, our museum was, I think they classify it as the authorized pre-screening of the movie here in the U.S. And when you watch a movie or a documentary about Cambodia, we kind of have to be mindful about the different focal lenses. You know, while showing First They Killed My Father, we had some Cambodians on one side bickering about missing facts or biased storyline. Then you have the other side. You have from the perspective of a veteran, for example. So they would see, the veterans would see the story a little bit differently. But also we have to be mindful that when we say veterans, there are different kinds of veterans. You have the veterans who were child soldiers fighting for the communists. And you have veterans who were fighting, who were labeled as the freedom fighters, who were siding with America. So of course, the two paradigms wouldn't mix very well. And then you have the perspective of the survivors of the intelligentsia who would not watch the movie with the same mindset as someone who grew up as a survivor of a farmer, of a Cambodian farmer, for example. So, but I think the movie did a great job to summarize what happened. I think if we get into kind of a danger zone when we try to extrapolate truth out of the movie, because they're really, yeah, you know, truth is sort of a contingent on the writer of the history and the producer and the director. But for the most part, it's got about 80% truth in there. And you'll never get 100% consensus. But I think it's done a good enough job for our American teachers to have a basic understanding of what happened. Because people did die. In the movie, people were dying. People were being shot by members of, by other Cambodians. The word enemy in the 1970s and 80s didn't have a clear definition. Who was your enemy? Was it the opposing veteran who was also a Cambodian? Was it a child soldier who had no idea what happened or why he was forced or lured into committing acts that he regrets today? So I would be kind of mindful about trying to extrapolate truth from any film.
Well, I appreciate that, and I think just because it's such an available resource, and so
yes,
you know, so important to be mindful of how we use things like that. Yeah, Joe, maybe I'll turn it back over to you if there are more questions.
Yeah, there's a related question to education. And maybe George, this is a question for you, but right now is teaching about the Cambodian genocide part of education standards in Minnesota?
I can step in and answer that. I don't know, Kosol, if you have other thoughts, but it's not. So it's not something that is required in Minnesota. And, you know, so I think this is where it would come down to individual decisions that are made by teachers, whether it's something that's included in their course or not. You know, whether it's a world history or global studies course, or, you know, indeed there are, you know, teachers who do teach genocide courses for advanced high school students. But those courses are few and far between, and I imagine it's not something that's commonly taught in schools. I don't know if you have a sense, Kosol, how common it would be to talk about the genocide in Minnesota schools.
Yeah, in Illinois, they do have, it is part of their curriculum in Illinois, and I believe they're still working on it in California, in Orange County and Long Beach, California. I hope that we can have the Southeast Asian history, if not the Cambodian history, as part of a social studies course in high school or in college. Because growing up, and I didn't receive any education on Cambodian history, let alone Southeast Asian history. So it's kind of, it would be, you'll be doing a great service, and you would be bringing tremendous value to people who are kind of wondering about, you know, who they are. So nothing would strengthen their identity better or more than a dose of reality of where they come from. And again, going back to importance, making people, when people know where they came from and where they're at and what they can achieve, then they start to feel like they're part of that. They feel like they're being included. And when people feel included, then they contribute more. When people feel that they're excluded, then they feel like, well, I have no ownership. I have no ownership in this new homeland, so therefore I don't vote. Because why would I vote? Because, you know, it's not my civic duty, because no one cares about what I say. So I think, and this isn't special or extraordinary facts that relate to just the Cambodian population. This, I would imagine it applies to all population of first generation and second generation Americans.
I think to follow up that question, Kosol, there's a really interesting question here from Gregory, wondering about whether the museum has recorded testimonies of survivors and what that process has been. I think you touched on it a little bit earlier on, but if you know of any other resources where testimonies of survivors are being archived.
Yeah, we have since the 1980s, the Minnesota History Society, the Minnesota Historic Society, have had recordings of key leaders in the community. But having gone through some of the archives, what I've noticed is that there wasn't a whole lot of personal stories. There wasn't a whole lot of personal journey of how people got here. It was sort of like it was limited to here I am in America and I'm working hard, but there wasn't a connection between when they arrived and what happened before they arrived. And I think it's important to connect that, because that's the formation of these Cambodian Americans. You can't call them Cambodian Americans unless they understand Cambodia or Cambodian history or Cambodian culture. They may look Asian to you, but unless they know about Cambodian culture, Cambodian history, and Cambodian customs and heritage and language, and then the only thing that's Cambodian about them would be their facial appearance. So I think it's important for us to recognize that it's again, going back, we need to kind of get people to identify with why they're here in the first place, and not just with the videos that we have. For example, at our museum, we've been working on videos for the past 5 years, and it would take us 5-10 different settings or different meetings before we even get to half of the video, half of a 10-minute video. Some of our elders have a difficult time expressing their pains and suffering, and also there's sort of a culture of humility in our with our Cambodian people. People like to kind of keep things down. The Cambodian people in general don't really embrace this idea of letting outsiders know about their personal struggle and challenges. So getting that out there and getting people to share was very difficult, and I still struggle today. But I think we did a pretty darn good job so far, because of the 20-30 elders who we had worked with, a good 4 to 6 of them have already passed on. So the numbers will continue to increase, and I would say in the next 10 years, or maybe even the next 7 years, we'll probably lose about 90% of our elders who hold key storylines, who hold history moments that should be shared to the younger generation. So to answer your question, yeah, we tried, and it's a very difficult task to try to record history.
And I think we've got and related to that question, we have a really interesting question here from Trisha, who writes, as a Cambodian American myself, I would love to hear your advice on guidance on how Cambodian Americans can play a role in the continuation and ongoing improvement of Khmer historical and cultural preservation and Khmer healing. And how can, the second question, how can Cambodian Americans like myself help encourage and create spaces of healing for other Cambodians and Cambodian Americans to share their stories?
Thank you. These are questions, they're sort of like my questions. So I spent a lot of time reflecting on similar questions. In my, I always remind my friends that in 1987, I was school president at a middle school in St. Paul. So student council president. I said in 1987, you say, well, that's not a big deal. We got Asian Americans now, running for president, and we have this and that, doing this and that. Yeah, it's true. But in 1987, it wasn't like it is today. There were still silent fear and not discrimination. I don't always use the word discrimination to describe our challenges. Sometimes it's just hidden fears from our colleagues and our friends around us. People who don't know who we are become fearful of who we are. But so throughout my high school years and college years, I've come to have a better understanding about who I am, and again, and how my differences and my difference with my other friends can actually add value to our new American culture. So I think to answer how can a Cambodian American add value to American culture, well, I would propose the idea that we promote what we feel proud about. The Cambodian people, the Cambodian culture started thousands of years ago. The oldest number 0 on record is in Cambodia. The number 0 as a placeholder, as a decimal point, is the number 506, which is in equivalence to 583 AD years, and Chaka calendar year 506. So the oldest number is 0, and the first largest city in the world was built in Cambodia. The largest religious monument in the world is arguably, and I believe, is in Cambodia. It's called the Angkor Wat. And thousands of temples throughout Southeast Asia, to me, translate into thousands of books, thousands of libraries are in Southeast Asia. When you travel, when you look at temples in Southeast Asia, you see rocks and stones. You see rubbles and rocks and stones. What's the big deal? But when you walk into those temples, you see writings, you see styles of martial arts, you see how recorded history on how people prepared food. You see the entire storyline of where these Cambodian people came from, how the Khmer people evolved, the Chinese influence of foreigners influencing Cambodian culture and history. So I think as a Cambodian American, I think it's very important for us to be included, but also to take ourselves and include ourselves in America, to be a part of America, and to add value to what we have here, to add importance to the American culture. And I think from the perspective of our friends, I would encourage, and if I can inspire non-Khmer Americans, I would sort of ask, just include Cambodians, include them in different activities. And sometimes we try to empathize people from the wrong focal lens. We try to feel their pains, which they might not need you to empathize for their pains. They just want you to just include them into your life, include them into your peers group, include them into your discussions, include them into your family life. So I think, and then for the Cambodian Americans, I think nothing will make me happier, I think, as a managing director of our organization and the Khmer Legacy Museum, than to be included. Is to be included. Because when we're included, it means that the genocide failed. Because when we're not included, it means that you've forgotten about us, or you have made a conscious decision not to include us, or you feel that it's not important enough, or you feel that it shouldn't be included. Then the genocide succeeded, because a genocide is designed to remove value, remove history, remove facts, remove an individual from being included on the world stage and from being included in America and other parts of the world. So nothing would make me feel more appreciated than to be included in more mainstream events and in more American lifestyle.
Oh, thank you. We've got a couple of questions about the Cambodian community here in Minnesota. One being is, how common is it for people, the community from Minnesota here, to go back to Cambodia? And what is that experience like going back to Cambodia? I know you've lived in Cambodia for a while. You know, what's it like going back? And the second question is, what was the response like for the Cambodian American community here to the tribunals in Cambodia?
I was lucky. It wasn't calculated and it wasn't planned. I was lucky because in 2008, both events sort of took place concurrently. I went to Cambodia as a Cambodian American, so you feel a sense of, you receive extraordinary treatment because you're American, but at the same time, they don't look at you as American. They look at you as Cambodian, but yet they don't really see the Cambodian in you. They see the Cambodian face in you, but they don't really see the Cambodian in you, because perhaps in the way that I carry myself, and the way I walk, the way I speak, and the way we bargain at the local markets. And Joe and George, maybe you've had experience over at the local markets in Cambodia, where if there's any detection of foreign influence, or they look like you're a foreigner or a Cambodian who's not local, well, there's price discretion on items you pay for at the market. So there's the Khmer word for someone like myself is anekajun. Anekajun. Jun means sort of a citizen, or so. Anekajun means a foreigner. So they look at me as a foreigner, and they don't really see me as a Khmer Cambodian. They see me as a foreigner who just happens to speak and look like Khmer. And so I worked for several different organizations in Cambodia, and I was able to kind of get a taste of our farmers and how they live, and how this city dwellers, how they live, and how government work in Cambodia. But as a Cambodian American, going to Cambodia for the first time, it was a major shock for me. I couldn't understand the Khmer spoken language at the local level. Whenever we had meetings or symposiums or seminars, I couldn't understand what these Cambodians were talking about. There was a level of respect for me because they knew that I wasn't local. So, but there was also a sense that that I wasn't close to them. You know, and probably the same way for George and Joe. When you went to Cambodia, they probably saw you as someone that perhaps that could bring opportunities, bring cheers, bring new jokes into their lives. But at the same time, they probably felt a sense that they could that you weren't their best friends. So it took me about 6 months or to a year before I became acclimated with the new culture. Again, I say the word new culture because at that time, the Cambodian lifestyle was a new culture for me, to be able to engage in conversations beyond surface level, and in order for me to understand their jokes and be able for me to engage with the local jokes. So it was a challenge, but it was also a sense of pride to be able to go back, and a sense of maybe a sense of having my dreams come true as well, to be able to go back to my birthplace and see where I came from. But at the end of the day, what I took back to Minnesota was this sense that I am more American than I am Cambodian. Because the way I speak, the way I think, the way I'm able to accept differences, there's racism in Cambodia too. There's racism, there's discrimination, there's although not a caste structure, but there's definitely a class separation amongst the people today, in the way that we regard another. We're just different, you know, especially people from Minnesota. We're different no matter where we go, even in America. When I ran across a new college graduate, a white Minnesotan in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and I recall to this day that her friend from Australia had made a comment. She said, "I cannot believe it. You guys sound so alike." I guess being that we're from Minnesota, there's something about us Minnesotans. There must be some sort of common traits about Minnesotans that people from Australia could identify for us that we might not know. And I would continue by saying that people in Cambodia, when they look at me, they probably see me as someone that just looks like them, but have nothing in common with them.
And I think a little follow-up to that too then is as a Cambodian American, what was your sense of the tribunals?
Yes, the tribunal. We had friends. Some of my co-workers at the time, they took part in the project with the tribunal. It was probably more important, I think, for non-Khmer Cambodians than it was for the local Cambodians, perhaps out of fear of getting involved in a discussion of that magnitude. Again, going back to First They Killed My Father, just having a film, a simple documentary, and trying to extract truth. Now imagine trying to extract truth from a tribunal. So, you know, how that whole episode ended is probably a good indicator how Cambodian Americans overall feel about the tribunal. They still feel a sense of loss today. Many feel that justice was not served and is not served. And you know, despite the many nations who contributed, I believe something like almost $500 million or $300 million to find truth, I don't think that most Cambodians feel that they received something that they really want, that the pains and sufferings are still there, and this may not have anything to do with the tribunal. It might just simply be a lack of healing mechanisms, or a lack of healing resources available to them. Imagine even today, the 55 and plus age group, the 55 plus Cambodian Americans in America today, something like 80% of them still suffer from post-traumatic syndrome. So the symptoms ranging from random fears, random sweating, people become easily suspicious of everyday life. Now imagine in Cambodia, if people in America who have lived here for 40, 50 years, 30, 40, 50 years, if they're still feeling the PTSD's effect, imagine the people in Cambodia, what they're feeling. So there's still a sense of fear, a sense of suspicion to speak out, because I don't know if George is nodding his head because he likes what I'm saying, or if he's nodding his head because he was a soldier with me at the time, or I don't know if George and Joe are just hiding his true feelings from me. Well, that's how people feel today in Cambodia. And I don't anticipate much improvement in the next 4 to 5 years until the, when I left Cambodia in 2012 to 2013, so now it's 2020, so 7 years later. So in 7 years, the 11-year-old that was in Cambodia when I was in Cambodia, so these 11-year-olds are now 18 years of age. And the baby boy and baby girl who were just born in 2012, they are now 7 and 8 years of age. So in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see tremendous change, because the people who are suffering from PTSDs, people who are afraid to speak out, who are challenged by invisible glass ceilings and invisible glass walls, they will either have passed on or they will have retired. So then we're dealing with a new generation of Cambodians in Cambodia, just as we will be facing the new Cambodian Americans who are living in America who have not been traumatized or as heavily traumatized. There's of course the PTSDs even in America are being passed down to the kids and grandkids, but at a milder level than in Cambodia, where the fears exist on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kosol. I think at this point we better put an end to the evening, just looking at the clock. But this has flown by for me and has just been a fantastic, a fascinating conversation. And so, again, for me and Alejandro and Joe at the center, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. And I'd like to thank Maria and Nicole, the ASL interpreters that were with us all evening, for their work. And then lastly, thank everyone who joined us tonight for this conversation. And I know there were a few questions still remaining about education, and I apologize that we didn't get to those. I will say just briefly, this is the second conversation in a series of conversations, similar conversations. Next week on Monday and Tuesday, we will have talks very similar in structure with the local Armenian and Ukrainian communities. And then the following week, we will have a series of educator workshops aimed at thinking about how do we take some of the content from these talks and also think about how to teach about aspects of genocide in K-12 classrooms. And so I hope you'll be able to join us for those events as well. So from all of us, thank you so much, and have a delightful evening.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Joe, and thank you, everyone in the group, for giving me this opportunity to share tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. I also want to express my gratitude. I enjoyed very much listening to your talk, Kosol. And there's this very simple but so important lesson that you taught us tonight, which we should have always present: the importance of acknowledgement, the importance of valuing, of recognizing and that's a universal element that we often don't have, we not always have in mind. So thank you for reminding us, and we hope
Thank you.
by providing this space, we have at least contributed somewhat to making that possible. So we count with you and with everyone who attended today in our following, in our next programs. Thank you all, and good evening.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.